Well, Stefan, last time I got to see you in your natural habitat at Innovate out in Houston, and now you're here in Dragonfly Studios. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's exciting to be here and kind of talk back on what we did back then and how far we've come. So.
Yeah, and talk about how far we've come. That was about 2 years ago or so ago. You and I were together shooting there with Proximy and Nadine and the team, and you gave us sort of some unfettered access to the theater of surgery. And my team still talks about sitting in on their first knee. What has transpired in the last 2 years in Innovate, first of all, and then generally in ASC business at large?
Yeah, that was sort of in the middle of COVID. I think we were still wearing masks at the time, and we were trying to ramp up, and so we had to deal with not just the part of starting to do total joints in the outpatient setting, but also dealing with some of the issues with COVID. The nice part about COVID for us was it really accelerated that movement to the outpatient setting, because while before COVID, patients really said, well, do I really want to have my total joint done in an ASC? And now we say, you don't have to go to the hospital. They're ecstatic. And so that has really helped us in order to ramp up the volume. We've now done over 2,500 total joints in the ASC. Very high quality, very high outcomes data, a very low infection rate. And it's been an absolute joy to be part of that journey for me, with my staff, and also with healthcare as a whole.
So you left the hospital setting and went to ASC. What was the impetus for that, if you can share that?
Yeah, so I was in private practice, then I was employed. When you become employed, the financial model there is that you do everything in the hospital, because the revenue in healthcare is not from the professional fee that I get paid from the insurance company, but from the fees that the hospital gets paid from a site of service. And so I was employed for 5 years, and I didn't like where healthcare was going, and I didn't like that I was part of this large machine that increased healthcare cost on an annual basis. And I just sort of had a come to Jesus meeting with myself, and I read an interesting book called Start With Why, and was much more purpose-driven, and exited and started Innovate. Hardest thing I ever did, but couldn't be happier today.
And so Innovate, how large is Innovate? How many ORs do you have? Got a team there as well.
So Innovate, there are really there are 3 companies, but 2 really portions. There's the private practice, which that's when we see patients and we negotiate with the payers on a professional side. I still work at the hospital, so 1 day a week I have to go to the hospital for complex cases, for patients that are just not risk stratified to the ASC. And then there's Innovate Surgical, which is the facility side, where we partner with a surgery center company who has a portion ownership of that, and they help us manage it. They help us also negotiate contracts, and they help us, revenue cycle management, putting protocols together, and all the nurses, scrub techs, they do the hiring and firing, which I'm sure we're going to get into in a little bit, because that can be a challenge, especially now in healthcare. And so that's the setup that I have currently. But I'm purely private practice, so I don't answer to anyone but myself.
That's
and my office manager.
and your wife.
Yeah, exactly.
So you were an earlier entrant into the ASC world, and over the last 24, 36 months, ASCs have become a high level of focus for alternative sites of care. As you pointed out, some of that was accelerated through the pandemic. But also it's being driven by doctors who don't want to be employees, and the cost, the reimbursement costs in an ASC, at times for valid reasons, is at a better value to the healthcare system than a hospital. What have you seen change over the last couple of years on both the pro and the con or liability side of ASCs looking forward?
Yeah, so the reason why that was possible, there are several factors that play a role. Number one, I think we've become better surgeons, and you know a lot about med tech, and so a lot of the technologies that we've implemented made us better surgeons to be more efficient in the operating room, be more predictable in the surgical part of it. So that's one part. The second part is that pain control is really the main reason why a patient would have to stay overnight in a hospital or 2 nights. And so there's been a lot of new technologies there, from nerve blocks, from regional anesthesia, from long-acting pain medications such as Exparel, that has really facilitated this same-day discharge from the surgery center. So I think those are the 2 main aspects that have made this possible to do it in a higher scale. There's always been surgeons over the last 10 years that have done 1 or 2 or 3 total joints per week in the surgery center, but they were very selective on who they did. And so what we've been able to do is to really increase the number of qualified patients that can be done in an ASC. We currently, based on the risk stratification questionnaire that we developed, 86% of patients are candidates for an ASC, which is huge, and that's all comers. That's the 90-year-old grandpa all the way to the 40-year-old workout fanatic that has a bad hip. So we can do a very high number of patients in the ASC, and that's really then allowed us to improve our protocols, and the staff is not all worried about just doing a total joints, because we'll do 6 or 8 in a day. And so I think that's really helped us to scale it in the ASC. To your last question is, there's been some challenges, right? We reduce cost, and the payers always want to, when we reduce cost, they always want to get a little bit more savings and get a little bit more savings. But as we all know, cost has gone up, staffing costs have gone up, but there's a lot more turnover with staffing. Nurses become travelers and they get paid a lot. So with inflation going through the roof, our cost has gone up. And so that's one of the things that we're battling a little bit with the payers, to say, look, we're providing a good product. We're providing a better product than the hospital in many ways. Reimburse us fairly. While we do want to reduce healthcare costs, we still got to make a margin.
And that, where do you get the leverage on that from the payers? So if ASCs, for the most part, there are some that are owned by private equity, some are independently owned. But where do you get that leverage rather than just a bean counting accountant or an actuarial coming out and saying, well, you got it down to 30, can you get it down to 27 now?
Yeah.
Right? So how do you negotiate against that? Where's your backstop?
That's the challenge. There's really no leverage, because we're not big enough. Well, if we say we're not going to take these rates, they say we don't care. And so, for example, one of the payers, we've tried to become in network ever since we opened, almost now 4 years ago, and they're not interested in bringing us in network for some reason. The way we have done it is to try to break down the dysfunctionality in the healthcare system between the payers and the providers by just developing relationships. So, when the Blue Cross Blue Shield head of network comes into town, he takes me out to dinner because we have such a good relationship. And so by really leading to them what the challenges are for us, and them realizing that private practice is very important for healthcare to survive, that's the only leverage we have been able to gather. But healthcare has a very strange market forces. It's not always cost matters. Sometimes it's access matters. Sometimes it's volume that matters. But it's an ever-changing industry. And for us, we always have to sort of figure out a new way of coaxing the payers to the negotiating table, to really plead to them that, look, we're doing good. Help us out.
Is there, or do you forecast the American Hospital Association, I think, is the 5th largest, or the 5th, pays the most lobbying every year, right, in Washington. Is there a lobbying organization for ASCs?
I'm not aware. I'm sure there are, but there's no lobbying organization for physicians. And, we can't get together and negotiate together unless we're on the same tax ID number. And that has sort of resulted in private equity going into healthcare and buying up physician groups. making them large enough where they then have negotiating power. But I don't like using negative negotiations. I like to use positive negotiations. And so to really get to the table and say, look, these are the facts. This is what we're dealing with. These are our numbers. Let's be transparent and let's figure out a way to do better. That's worked on a small scale for us. But I don't know what the solution is on Alaska, because the hospital lobby is very, very strong, as you know. And they are going to fight this to a T.
Yeah, they really are. And hospitals have a very difficult time pricing their procedures at where you or an ASC can price theirs. And some of it's inefficiency, but some of it is just the other programs and systems and redundancies they have to have in place that get rolled into the cost of doing a procedure.
No doubt. I mean, and I would never badmouth a hospital or a hospital system. They have to deal with the unpaid, the uninsured. They have to deal with, high cost that doesn't make any revenue for the system. So they need to get paid extra for the commercial stuff and for the elective stuff in order to make up for the areas where they lose money. But they are very inefficient, and there's a lot of hospital administrators that probably are not necessary. And I think in the long run, where we really can make a big difference is in order to really maintain the healthcare cost at a lower cost, is to improve efficiency, to get rid of all the bureaucratic burden from collections, from coding, from getting pre-certification, authorizations, all that stuff. I mean, we spend 40% of our time, my staff spends just dealing with insurance companies trying to get approval to get paid. Just crazy.
Yeah. So one of the things ASCs have become proficient at and continue, you mentioned technology, and certainly whether it's imaging, navigation, surgical robotics, those certainly can expedite a case, can create better outcomes, and the data still needs to come back on whether or not there's a cost to the surgery. But I think it depends on where do you take your cost to? Does it at the site of episodic care, or is it the journey of the patient and the final outcome there? But there seems to be other technologies entering into ASCs now, and almost workforce optimization beyond just a surgical robot or the ability to see something that you couldn't have seen before in other centers of health. I know you're a data-driven guy. We were sitting in the green room together, and you monitor a lot of things on you yourself. And we were talking about certain technologies, and docs generally, surgeons don't like to be monitored. So what are some of the technologies you see coming into ASC? What are some that you use that at large would help healthcare?
My favorite saying is what can be measured can be managed. So data is important to me and always has been. And there are some really great technologies that can improve the efficiency in the current workflow. There's one company that we're talking to that puts a monitoring or tracking band onto the patient when they arrive, and it does all kinds of data on how long are they in the holding area, how long are they in the operating room, how long does it take to turn over a room. What it also does, it sends the information to the family members so that they know, okay, now Bob is in the OR and now he's in recovery. So that improves that communications with them, because right now what I have to do is after I'm done with the surgery, I call the patient. Well, then they don't pick up. And then 15 minutes later, I got a call from the nurses. Nobody ever talked to the family. Said, well, I tried to call the family, but the family didn't pick up. And so then in the middle of surgery, I have to scrub out and call the family, let them know that everything went well. So I think all those kind of processes to improve communications and improve efficiency in the operating room or in the surgery center is so much easier to implement in the surgery center because it's a sort of a closed system, and there's not a lot of layers of administrative people that have to approve this kind of stuff. And so that's what I'm really excited about moving forward. I think we have a really good base as far as efficiency, but the efficiency that we currently have comes from having really good staff that are intrinsically motivated and efficient. But to really get it into a data set to fine tune, I think is very exciting. I don't mind being monitored. I'd love to have a little braces to know how many steps I take and where do I go and when my next patient is ready and so forth. And so to me, that's really exciting. And they do it in other industry. This company apparently came from the car industry, from a repair center, where they know exactly at what stage what car is in what stage of repair, and what the next screw or nut or clutch needs to be brought in order to efficiently put them through that process. And so I'm excited about that kind of technology.
Yeah, and you also do a really good job, you and I were chatting a while back, of an intake to stratify the risk on your patient as well. And that determines whether it's a patient or not, but maybe even more important, is there a special approach to this surgery?
Yeah. So what we've developed, which I'm really proud of, and it has helped us a lot, is to have a very robust stratification questionnaire to A, determine whether the patient is a candidate for the ASC, B, determine that there are any factors that need to be addressed prior to surgery from a clearance standpoint, whether they have a elevated hemoglobin A1C or if they're on the obese side. So these are patient modifiable factors that can be addressed. But also to then, the third part is to define what are their risks. Because everybody has risk. I mean, surgery is a risky procedure. It's very, very safe, but things can happen. And the more you know before to mitigate those risks, the less likely something is happening. So we define what their bleeding risk is. So if they have an elevated bleeding risk, then we might take a cell saver, make sure that we capture all the blood to give it back to the patient. There's a blood clot risk. And if we know that they have an increased DVT risk to have blood clot after surgery, then we use different medications. And the other, much more common now than it used to be in the past, is nickel allergy. 98% of implants put into patients have nickel. Well, some patients have nickel allergy, and we need to know that before, because then we use a different type of implant that doesn't have any nickel in it. And it's actually become fairly common that now we're doing an FDA clearance study of a ceramic implant that doesn't have any nickel at all. So those kind of things we want to know before surgery and before they schedule, because we don't want to find out the week before, oh, this patient should have been done at the hospital, because then it's a fire drill, they reschedule them. And so from that process, again, improves the efficiency for the patient, and it avoids redoing things and rescheduling things, because reschedules are just a nightmare.
You have always been a very early adopter of advanced technologies, surgical technologies, as well as just in centers of care. I know organizations flock to you, especially on the robotic side of things and orthopedics. What have been your observations over the years? What are you most excited about today? And then what should we be sort of focused on in the near-term future?
Yeah. From a surgeon standpoint, technology, I'm really excited about robotics. I think we're fairly in the infancy on robotics. I think we have learned a lot from the current platforms of what they can do and what they cannot do. And I think the future is really in customization for a patient. Right now, we have a fairly, how should I say this, general surgical plan with an off-the-shelf implant that we use for everybody. And I think we do very well with that, but knee replacements don't run marathons. And can we really personalize medicine, which is done so much now with prevention of health of diseases? I know you have a VIP doctor that you go to, and he really personalizes your care to you, and even on the diet stuff, we're really getting into personalization. Can we be more personalized in our approach to hip and knee replacement for patients? And for that, we need a good planning tool, we need a custom implant, and we need a good surgical tool, which is a robot. And that's what I'm excited about. I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to really change on how we do knee replacement.
I want to dig into that a little bit. And most of the organizations that have surgical robots bought them to sell the implants that sit on their shelf, not the other way around.
Yeah.
Right? So the Smith & Nephews, great companies, but we have to call the model for what the model is. It was, we will give you a robot if you use this many knees, and then if you don't, well, there's consequences. So that drives to the product on the shelf, not necessarily the best product for the patient.
Yeah. That's very true. And the reason that is, in my opinion, and again, that's my opinion, and the device companies may disagree with that, but the development cycle of developing a new knee is anywhere from 5 to 7 years. And it starts out with a company deciding, okay, we're going to design a new knee. Then they got to put together a consultant team. Then they got to get together with the engineers. Then they have to develop certain designs or concepts. Then we do cadaver labs to kind of test those concepts. Then we get back together and redesign it. And then there comes the point of design freeze. And design freeze is no more changes can be made, especially on the implant, because then you have to submit that to the FDA. Now, the FDA could take anywhere from 3 months to 2 years to get this cleared. You have to do all the testing, got to make sure that the smallest implant and the biggest implant go through certain testing. Then you finally get FDA clearance. Then you do a limited market release to the design surgeons and maybe some evaluators. So they'll use the implant for maybe a year or so, give feedback to the company, making sure that it actually works well, and then you release to the actual market for every surgeon to use it. So that could be, again, 5 to 7 years. And an enormous amount of cost involved in that. Now the device company has to recoup that cost, so they don't want to redo this every 5 years. So once the design is done and the instruments, because the instrument sets are very expensive, they cost anywhere from $30,000 to $50,000, maybe $70,000. And so they now want to recoup their revenue by having lots of turns on those instruments and selling implants. Because the cost of manufacturing of the implant is small. The revenue is very high, but they got to recoup all that. And so with robotics, all they want to do is sell more implants. And Stryker was the first robotic company to market. And now every other company came up with a robot in order as a defensive play because they were losing market share to Stryker because they had a robot. So in my opinion, in order to really change that, you have to change on how you design implants. And so for me, that's a custom design, because a custom design you can change every time you do it. And so you don't have that design freeze of a single particular implant. You have the design freeze incorporates a whole array of ranges from the biggest to the smallest, and you can design anything within that range. I think that's when we can really change the game. And robotics plays a role in that in order to be accurate.
Are there any organizations right now that you're familiar with that's providing a custom solution to a knee?
Yeah, so there are 2 companies, one in Europe and one in the US. US, it's Conformis, and in Europe, it's Symbios. They both have custom implants. They've had a very challenging time because the cost is very high. But I think with 3D printing, the future looks bright for those type of companies.
And then we could then have an organization that just made maybe a best-in-class robot that was not in the implant business. That, as we see happening, surgical robotics is a really tough nut to crack. I don't care if it's orthopedic, I don't care if it's soft tissue, neuro, what have you. And to be world-class at both the implant and the robot is a very unique situation. So you're sort of compromising both. You're getting an implant company that's not quite a robotics company, but a motor robotics company, and there's not a lot of leapfrogs in the technology there. And if you get just a robotic company who really doesn't want to invest the money in knee implants, now you're getting a compromised knee if they work. So this is where you're able to not have to use a Smith & Nephew or a Stryker knee, but you can use best in class in both.
Completely agree. I mean, that's what needs to happen. It's an open platform robotics company that can use any kind of implant. The challenge there is then, in order for the robot to implant a certain implant, they will have to have the cut files or the models from that device company. And if they sell their own robot, they may not want to partner. And so it really needs to be a good robotics company that will put some pressure on the device companies to say, look, we need to partner together. There's no reason that the hospital, when they have 4 surgeons using 4 different device companies, have to buy 4 robots. Can you imagine the nurses? I mean, every robot is different. Every setup is different. I mean, talking about a killer for efficiency, for throughput, if you have that situation. One robot one efficiency, one process, and then it doesn't matter which implant you put in. I mean, you buy a drill a DeWalt drill from Home Depot, you can use it with any kind of screw. You just got to know the diameter, and you can use that. And so, and I hope that that's where we'll go.
With the orthopedic robots today, and you've done, I don't know personally how many thousands or tens of thousands of knees, you're pretty prolific. What are the robotic companies over-featuring on the robot that they might not need? And what are they under-clubbing in regards to not paying enough attention to, perhaps? Just maybe not a robotic company in particular, but at large, what you see out there.
Yeah. Do you want to answer specific to total knees? Because that's really where most of the robotic is. Yeah. Yeah. So a knee replacement is a bony operation and a soft tissue operation. And you see back here, you see the implants, you see the knee being exposed. Obviously, we have to expose the knee, and there's ligaments. And everybody's familiar with the ACL, the anterior cruciate ligament. There's actually 4 main ligaments in the knee: the medial collateral, the lateral collateral, the ACL, and the PCL. And when you take out the old knee and put in a new knee, it's really important that it's put in so that these ligaments are perfectly well balanced, because really, technically, the knee is not a stable joint. It gets all its stability from the soft tissue around it. And in order for that soft tissue to be perfectly balanced, that's, in my opinion, the key to success. Now, all the robotics company, except one, really focus on what's called gap balancing. So they try to make really accurate cuts and then make the assumption that the ligaments are balanced. Now, if there is an inaccuracy in the robot and you have stacking of errors, these assumptions are incorrect. And that's, I think, what some of the challenges with the robotics company. So there's got to be more technology developed, and there are some companies that are working on that now. And there's one from Australia that's trying to get into market. There's one in Austria that unfortunately didn't make it. We're trying to look at buying those assets that really addresses the soft tissue. And it's tension. You measure the tension of the ligament, and you know sort of what the range is, and then that can then guide your surgical plan. That's where the future, I think, comes with robot. Where the future needs to go with robotic surgery.
So I'm in my brain, in my engineering brain, I'm thinking about the knee, the patella sitting there, and then 4 springs that all have a force on them.
That's exactly right.
And they all have to sort of be in balance and harmony with each other, because if I'm pulling too far in one, right, the other is. So no matter how good of a surgery I do, once they're closed up and those tendons establish their force factor, it's probably going to pull things out of alignment.
Yeah, and that's a great analogy. Springs is probably better than ligament tension. That's exactly right. And you have a car and you have one of the front tires being a little bit lower in air, or the spring there is a little bit reduced. That car is just not going to drive quite correctly. It'll still drive, and you'll still get to the grocery store, but it's not going to be a smooth ride as they're perfectly aligned and perfectly balanced.
Right, and then eventually that'll transfer to the hip and then to the lower back, right? And then ever since I had my knee replaced, my lower back hurts.
That's
right?
exactly right. Yeah, no, and I think those are the kind of things that we're working on now. We're doing a lot of studies on looking how does a certain balance algorithm correlate with a certain outcome. So we do studies where we'll get up and go test and the 5-minute walk test and see what the quad function is and how does that all impact. So, because that's really where we have not done a good job, is to correlate what we did in surgery to clinical outcome. And there are challenges with that because patients don't want to do questionnaires all the time, and our patient population is so different, from the 5'1", 250-pound person to the 6'3" high athlete. They have such different levels of activity, so it's really hard to compare that. But that's really where the research needs to go. Then almost create that feedback loop, add some AI to really drive that planning for every particular patient. That's what I mentioned earlier. I think a very personalized surgical plan is where we need to go. And it's going to be different for you than it is for me, which is going to be different for grandma who only goes to the grocery store. And that's really where we need to go.
Yeah, and then I also know that there's organizations out there like Canary and others that are working on that implant business that are putting an active implant to measure certain dynamics in the implant that then allow us to get outcomes, or at least data as well, that's not interpretive in nature, but is based in science.
The beauty about the Canary implant, it's 24/7.
Yeah.
You don't have to depend on a patient wearing an eye watch that's being charged in the most critical part of the day where we monitor their activity. The Canary's there 24/7 because it's part of the implant. It's a little stick at the end of the tibia, and it gives you, and it's going to be really interesting to see what kind of data comes out of that device.
Yeah.
Very exciting.
Is that reimbursed these days, or is it self-pay? Because some of those have been non-reimbursable self-pay.
Yeah, so I think it's self-pay, that the patient has to pay for it, or the facility has to pay for it. I think Zimmer Biomet and Canary are very, very enthusiastic about getting more implanted, so they make it quite cost-effective. Can't imagine that what they charge is even going to cover their cost. It might. I mean, I don't know what their cost model is, but that data is going to be incredibly helpful for us.
Well, it's going to help you improve care. Mm-hmm. Based on pure data, not interpretation, not on non-compliance.
Yeah.
So it's a little mind-numbing of why that sensor on board that's giving you true outcomes is not covered under reimbursement. So.
Yeah, the challenge is, I mean, this Canary device is another tool in our toolbox for this personalized care. You know, I talked about personalized care in the operating room, but it also needs to be personalized care in the postoperative period. You know, when do they need a little bit more physical therapy? When they need a little less physical therapy? What's their range of motion? Do they need a manipulation? You know, if they are walking less, do they have more pain? Do we need to call them to give them more pain medicine so they can manage all this? So this really allows it to be more personalized in the care for the patient. The challenge is, it's the physician that has to do that. And we don't have enough time as it is. We don't have enough resources as it is. We don't get reimbursed for it. Now there are some reimbursement codes, and we've got another call with one of the companies about patient monitoring and what is defined by patient monitoring, whether you can bill the insurance for that. But the margins are so small that you really have to be careful to put all that impetus on the physicians to do, where we are the lowest paid in the whole cycle of reimbursement for a total joint.
Mm.